But it was a clear sign that our presence in Afghanistan would not be tolerated indefinitely. This was made clear to me some days later when 3 members of the cont'd secret police turned up at the reception desk at the Intercontinental to see me. They all wore leather coats, de rigueur, I think that's how that's pronounced, for plainclothes cops in Soviet satellite countries, and they were not smiling. One of them, a small man with a thin mustache and a whining voice, held out a piece of paper. "We have come to see you about this," he snapped. I took the paper from him, a telegram bearing the stamp of the Afghan PTT office, and as I read the contents, I swallowed several times, the kind of guilty swallow that criminals make in movies when confronted with evidence of some awesome crime. "Urgent. Bob Fisk guest Intercontinental Hotel, Kabul," it said. "Any possibility of getting 2-minute update re Soviet military buildup in Afghanistan for Sunday morning this week? Love, Sue Hickey." I drew in my breath. "Jesus Christ," I shouted. How could Sue have sent such a telegram? For days I had been sending tapes to CBC describing the atmosphere of fear and danger in Afghanistan, and here was Sue sending me an open telegram requesting details of Soviet military deployment in a state run by pro-Moscow communists. It was, I suspected, part of a very old problem. Somewhere between reporters and their offices in faraway London or New York, there exists a wall of gentle disbelief, an absolute fascination with the reporter's dispatch from the war zone, but an unconscious conviction that it is all part of some vast Hollywood production, that the tape or the film, though obviously not fraudulent, is really a massive theatrical production, that the Russian army was performing for us, the world's press, that the cont'd always referred to in news reports as the dreaded secret police was somehow not that dreadful after all. Indeed, might be present in Afghanistan to give just a little more excitement to our stories. I looked at the little man from cont'd. He was looking at me with a kind of excitement in his face. He was one of the few who could speak passable English, and he had caught his man. The Western spy had been found with incontrovertible proof of his espionage activities, a request for military information about the Soviet army. "What does this mean?" the little man asked softly. Oh, yes, indeed. What did this mean? I needed time to think, so I burst into laughter. I put my head back in positively gusted laughter around the lobby of the hotel until even the receptionist turned to find out the cause of the joke. And I noticed one of the cops grinning. He wanted in on the joke, too. I slowly let my laughter subside and shook my head warily. "Look, this lady wants me to report for a radio show called Sunday Morning in Canada," I said. "There is no Soviet military buildup. We all know that because President Karmal told us that only a very limited Soviet contingent has come to Afghanistan. This lady obviously doesn't know that. I have to clear up this ridiculous situation and report the truth. I'm sorry you've been bothered with such a silly message, and I can certainly understand why you were worried about it." And I laughed again. Even the little cop smiled sheepishly. I offered him back the incriminating telegram. "No, you keep it," he snapped, and he wagged his finger in my face. "We know you know," he said. "I'm sorry," I asked. "What did he know?" But the lads from the cont'd had turned their backs and walked away. "Thank you, Sue." Weeks later, we dined out on the story, and she paid for the meal. Yet it was all too easy to turn the Soviet occupation into a one-dimensional drama of brutal Russian invaders and plucky Afghan guerrillas, a kind of flip-side version of the fictional Tom Graham's Second Afghan War. A succession of pro-Soviet dictators had ruled Afghanistan with cruelty, with socialist cant and pious economic plans, but also through tribal alliances, the Pathans and the Hazaras, who were Shia Muslims, and the Tajiks and the Giljais, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and the Duranis and the Uzbeks could be manipulated by the government in Kabul. It could bestow power on a leader prepared to control his town on behalf of the communist authorities, but could withhold funds and support from anyone who did not. Prison, torture, and execution were not the only way to ensure political compliance, but among the tribes deep within the deserts and valleys of Afghanistan, the same communist governments had been trying to cajole and then force upon these rural societies a modern educational system in which girls as well as boys would go to school, at which young women did not have to wear the veil, in which science and literature would be taught alongside Islam. 21 years later, an American president would ostentatiously claim that these were among his own objectives in Afghanistan. And I remember one excursion out of Jalalabad in those early days of the Soviet invasion. I had heard that a schoolhouse had been burned down in a village 25 kilometers from the city and set off in an exhaust-fuming Russian-built taxi to find out if this was true. It was, but there was much worse. Beside the gutted school there hung from a tree a piece of blackened meat, twisting gentle in the breeze. One of the villagers, urging my driver to take me from the village, told us that this was all that was left of the headmaster. They had also hanged and burned his school-teacher wife. The couple's sin, to comply with government rules that girls and boys should be taught in the same classroom. And what about those Pakistanis and Egyptians and Saudis who were, according to Karmal, supporting the terrorists? Even in Jalalabad, I heard that Arabs had been seen in the countryside outside the city, although, typical of our innocence at that time, I regarded these stories as untrue. How could Egyptians and Saudis have found their way here? And why Saudis? But when I heard my colleagues, especially American journalists, referring to the resistance as freedom fighters, I felt something going astray. Guerrillas, maybe, even fighters, but freedom fighters? What kind of freedom were they planning to bestow upon Afghanistan? Of their bravery there was no doubt, and within 3 weeks of the Soviet invasion came the first signs of a unified Muslim political opposition to the Karmal government and its Russian supporters. The few diplomats left in Kabul called them night letters. Crudely printed on cheap paper, the declarations and manifestos were thrown into embassy compounds and pushed between consular fences during the hours of curfew, their message usually surmounted by a drawing of the Quran. The most recent of them, and it was now mid-January of 1980, purported to come from the United Muslim Warriors of Afghanistan, and bore the badge of the Islamic Afghan Front, one of the 4 groups which had been fighting in the south of the country. From the open pages of the Quran, there sprouted 3 rifles. The letter denounced the regime for inhuman crimes and condemned Soviet troops in the country for treating Afghans like slaves. Muslims, it said, will not give up fighting or guerrilla attacks until our last breath. The proud and aggressive troops of the Russian power have no idea of the rights and human dignity of the people of Afghanistan. The letter predicted the death of Karmal and 3 of his cabinet ministers, referring to the president as Kargal, a play on words in Persian, which means thief of work. The first man to be condemned was Asadullah Sarwari, a member of the Afghan Presidium, who was Taraki's secret police chief, widely credited with ordering the torture of thousands of Taraki's opponents. Others on the death list included Shah Jan Mazdoryar, a former interior minister who was now Karmal's transport minister. The night letter also included specific allegations that the Soviet army was committing acts which are intolerable to our people, adding that Russian soldiers had kidnapped women and girls working in a bakery in the Dar-Larman suburb of Kabul and returned them next morning after keeping them for the night. A similar incident, the letter stated, had occurred in the suburb of Kahir Khana, an act of aggression against the dignity of Muslim families. When I investigated these claims, bakery workers in Darlaman told me that women workers who normally bake bread for Afghan soldiers had refused to work for Soviet troops, and that the Russians had consequently taken the women from the bakery and forced them to bake bread elsewhere, but they were unclear about the treatment the women had received and were too frightened to say more. The authors of the letters said the Muslims would eventually overthrow Karmal, and judiciously added that they would then refuse to honor any foreign contracts made with his government. At the bottom it says, Karmal was flown back to Moscow by the Russians in 1986 to be replaced by Mohammad Najibullah, the head of the cont'd secret police. He was subsequently deposed by Mujahideen factions and took shelter in the UN's Kabul offices in 1992, 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal. In 1996, the Taliban took Najibullah from his dubious protectors. "Some men have come for you," one of the UN officials bleakly announced to Moscow's former servant, and, after emasculating the former secret serviceman, hanged him from a tree along with his brother. Afghan currency bills stuffed into his mouth and pockets. This was, no doubt, the fate that the Night Letters authors had hoped for Karmal, who was to die of cancer in 1996 in Moscow. Then they added, hopelessly, and perhaps a little pathetically, that their statements should be broadcast over the BBC at 8:45 p.m. without censorship. Still, Gavin and I ventured out most days with Steve, Jeff, Mike, and the faithful Mr. Samadali. We were halfway up the Salange Pass, 130 kilometers north of Kabul, on the 12th of January, when our car skidded on the ice and a young Russian paratrooper from the 105th Airborne Division ran down the road, waving his automatic rifle at us and shouting in Russian. He had been wounded in the right hand, and blood was seeping from the bullet hole through his makeshift bandage and staining the sleeve of his battle dress. He was only a teenager, with fair hair and blue eyes and a face that showed fear. He had clearly never before been under fire. Beside us, a Soviet Army transport lorry, its rear section blown to pieces by a mine, lay upended in a ditch. There were 2 tracked armored carriers just up the road, and a Russian paratroop captain ran towards us to join his colleague. "Who are you?" he asked in English. He was dark-haired and tired, dressed in a crumpled tunic, a hammer and sickle buckle on his belt. We told him we were correspondents, but the younger soldier was too absorbed with the pain from his wound. He reapplied the safety catch on his rifle, then lifted up his hand for our inspection. He raised it with difficulty and pointed to a snow-covered mountain above us where a Russian military helicopter was slowly circling the peak. "They shoot Russians," he said. He was incredulous. No one knew how many Russians the guerrillas had shot, although a villager a mile further south insisted with undisguised relish that his compatriots had killed hundreds. But the ambush had been carefully planned. The mine had exploded at the same time as a charge had blown up beneath a bridge on the main highway, so for almost 24 hours half of a Russian convoy en route to Kabul from the Soviet frontier was marooned in the snow at an altitude of more than 7,000 feet. Russian engineers had made temporary repairs, and we watched as the Soviet trucks made their way down from the mountains, slithering on the slush and parked ice. 156 tracked armored vehicles, 8-wheel personnel carriers, and 300 lorry loads of petrol, ammunition, food, and tents. The drivers looked exhausted. The irony, of course, was that the Russians had built this paved highway through the 11,900-foot pass. That night, the U.S. State Department claimed that 1,200 Russian soldiers had been killed. It seemed an exaggeration, but the bloody-minded villager may have been right about the hundreds of dead. A very limited contingent indeed. Karmal's government held a day of mourning for those killed by the butcher Amin. The British embassy even lowered its flag to half-mast, but only a few hundred people turned up at the yellow-painted Polakeshti mosque to pray for their souls, and they were for the most part well-dressed PDP functionaries. 4 young men who arrived at the mosque in northern Kabul and attempted to avoid the signing ceremony were reminded of their party duties by a soldier with a bayonet fixed to his rifle. They signed the book. The rest of the Kabul maintained the uneasy tenor of its new life. The bazaars were open as usual, and the street sellers with their sweet meats and oils continued to trade beside the ice-covered Kabul River. In the old city, a Western television crew was stoned by a crowd after being mistaken for Russians. Kabul had an almost bored air of normality that winter as it sat in its icy basin in the mountains, its wood smoke drifting up into the pale blue sky. The first thing all of us noticed in the sky was an army of kites, large box kites, triangular and rectangular kites, and small paper affairs, painted in blues and reds and often illustrated with a large and friendly human eye. No one seemed to know why the Afghans were so obsessed with kites, although there was a poetic quality to the way in which the children, doll-like creatures with narrow Chinese features, swaddled in coats and embroidered capes, watched their kites hanging in the frozen air, those great paper eyes with their long eyelashes floating towards the mountains. Gavin and I once asked Mr. Samadali to take us to the zoo. Inside the gate, a rusting sign marked vultures led to some of the nastiest birds on earth, skeletal rather than scrawny. Past the hog pit, a trek through deep snow brought us to the polar bear cages. But the cage doors were open and the bears were missing. Even more disquieting was the silent group of turbaned men who followed us around the zebra park, apparently under the illusion we were Russians. It must have been the only zoo in the world where the visitors were potentially more dangerous than the animals. We even managed to find Afghanistan's only railway locomotive, a big early 20th century steam engine bought by King Amanullah from a German manufacturer. It sat forlorn and rusting near a ruined palace, its pistons congealed together and guarded by policemen who snatched at our cameras when we tried to take a picture of this old loco, a doubly absurd event since there is not a single active railway line in all of Afghanistan. Perhaps by way of compensation, the truck drivers of Afghanistan had turned their lorries into masterpieces of Afghan pop art, every square inch of bodywork covered in paintings and multicolored designs. Afghan lorry art possessed a history all its own, which took off when metal sheeting was added to the woodwork of long-distance trucks. The panels were turned into canvases by artists in Kabul and later Kandahar. Lorry owners paid large sums to these painters. The more intricate the decoration, the more honored the owner became, and the art was copied from Christmas cards, calendars, comics, and mosques. Tarzan and the horse of Imam Ali could be seen side by side with parrots, mountains, helicopters, and flowers. 3-paneled rail boards on Bedford trucks provided perfect triptychs. A French author once asked a lorry owner why he painted his coachwork and received the reply that it is a garden, for the road is long. Inevitably, Karmal tried to appease the Mujahideen, seeking a ceasefire in rural areas through a series of secret meetings between government mediators and tribal leaders in Peshawar. A PDP statement announced that it would begin friendly negotiations with National Democratic Progressives and Islamic circles and organizations. This new approach, intriguing though doomed, was accompanied by a desperate effort on the part of the government to persuade itself that it was acquiring international legitimacy. Kabul newspapers carried the scarcely surprising news that favorable reactions to the new regime had come from Syria, Kampuchea, and India, as well as the Soviet Union and its East European satellites. In a long letter to Ayatollah Khomeini, whose Islamic revolution in Iran was the previous year had so frightened the Soviets, Karmal criticized the adverse Iranian response to his coup. It had been condemned by Iranian religious leaders and sought to assure the Ayatollah that the murder of Muslim tribesmen in Afghanistan had been brought to an end with Amin's overthrow. My government will never allow anybody to use our soil as a base against the Islamic Revolution in Iran and against the interest of the fraternal Iranian people, he wrote. We expect our Iranian brothers to take an identical stance. Iran, needless to say, was in no mood to comply. Within days, the Soviet invasion, the foreign ministry in Tehran, had stated that Afghanistan is a Muslim country and the military intervention of the government of the Soviet Union in the neighboring country of our co-religionists is considered a hostile measure against all the Muslims of the world. Within months, and aware that the United States was sending aid to the guerrillas, Iran would be planning its own military assistance program for the insurgents. By July, Sadek Kobzada? If anyone knows, I'll look this up afterwards and put it in the description. My best guess is Kobzada. The Iranian foreign minister was telling me that he hoped his country would give weapons to the rebels of the Soviet Union, did not withdraw its army. Some proposal to this effect has been given to the Revolutionary Council, he told me in Tehran. Just as we were against the American military intervention in Vietnam, we think exactly the same way about the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union claims that they have come to Afghanistan at the request of the Afghan government. The Americans were in Vietnam at the request of the Vietnamese government. But at this stage, Karmal had more pressing problems than Iran. Desperate to maintain the loyalty of the Afghan army, we heard reports that only 60% of the force was now following orders. Karmal even made an appeal to their patriotism, promising increased attention to their material needs. These heroic officers, patriotic cadets, and valiant soldiers were urged to defend the freedom, honor, and security of your people, with high hopes for a bright future. Material needs clearly meant back pay. The fact that such an appeal had to be made at all said much about the low morale of the Afghan army. No sooner had he tried to appease his soldiers than Karmal turned to the Islamists who had for so long opposed the communist regimes in Kabul. He announced that he would change the Afghan flag to reintroduce green, the color of Islam, so rashly deleted from the national banner by Taraki, to the fury of the clergy. At the same time, and Karmal had an almost unique ability to destroy each new political initiative with an unpopular countermeasure. He warned that his government would treat terrorists, gangsters, murderers, and highwaymen with revolutionary decisiveness. For terrorists, red guerrillas, or, as President Ronald Reagan would call them in the years to come, freedom fighters, terrorists. In the Middle East, in the entire Muslim world, this word would become a plague, a meaningless punctuation mark in all our lives, a full stop erected to finish all discussion of injustice, constructed as a wall by Russians, Americans, Israelis, British, Pakistanis, Saudis, Turks to shut us up. Who would ever say a word in favor of terrorists? What cause could justify terror? So our enemies are always terrorists. In the 17th century, governments used heretic in much the same way, to end all dialogue, to prescribe obedience. Karmal's policy was simple: you are either with us or against us. For decades I have listened to this dangerous equation, uttered by capitalists and communists, presidents and prime ministers, generals and intelligence officers, and, of course, newspaper editors. In Afghanistan there were no such formulaic retreats. In my cozy room at the Intercontinental, each night I would spread out a map. What new journey could be made across this iced plateau before the Russians threw us out? With this in mind, I realized that the full extent of the Russian invasion might be gauged from the Soviet border. If I could reach Mazar-e-Sharif, far to the north of the Amu Darya River, I would be close to the frontier of the Soviet Union and could watch their great convoys entering the country. I packed a soft Afghan hat and a brown green-fringed shawl I'd bought in the bazaar, along with enough dollars to pay for several nights in a Mazar hotel, and set off before dawn to the cold but already crowded bus station in central Kabul. The Afghans waiting for the bus to Mazar were friendly enough. When I said I was English, there were smiles, and several young men shook my hand. Others watched me with the same suspicion as the 3 cont'd men at the Intercontinental. There were women in burqas who sat in silence in the back of the wooden vehicle. I pulled my Afghan hat low over my forehead and threw my shawl over my shoulder. Cowled in cigarette smoke from the passengers, I took a seat on the right-hand side of the bus because the soldiers on checkpoint duty always approached from the left. The bus growled up the highway towards Solange as the first sun shone bleakly over the snow plains. Gavin and I had now driven this road so many times that despite its danger, the highway was familiar, almost friendly. On the right was the big Soviet base north of Kabul airport. Here was the Afghan checkpoint outside Charikar. This was where the young Russian soldier had shown us the wound in his hand. Soldiers at the Afghan checkpoints were too cold to come aboard and look at the passengers. When Soviet soldiers made a cursory inspection, I curled up in my seat with my shawl around my face. 3 hours later, the bus pulled over to the side of the highway just short of the Solange tunnel. There were Russian armored vehicles parked a few meters away, and a clutch of soldiers with blue eyes and brown hair poking from beneath their fur hats. That's when things went wrong. A Soviet officer approached the bus from the right-hand side, and his eyes met mine. Then a man inside the bus, an Afghan with another thin mustache, pointed at me. He marched down the aisle, stood next to my seat, and raised his finger, pointing it straight at my face. Betrayed. That was the word that went through my mind. I had watched this scene in a dozen movies, so no doubt had the informer. This man must have been working for the Afghan secret police, saw me climb aboard in Kabul, and waited until we reached this heavily guarded checkpoint to give me away. Another young Afghan jumped from the bus. Walked down to the right side of the vehicle, and then he too pointed at me through the window. Doubly betrayed. We were 100 miles from Kabul. If I had cleared this last major barrage, I would have been through the tunnel and on to Mazar. And I'm going to end it there for now. Thank you guys for listening.